Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Tuesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis, all dealing with President Trump's nomination of D.C. Circuit Appeals Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh to be the next Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. But first, we want to let you know today that we are sponsored by Lending Club. Right now, you can check your rate in minutes and borrow up to $40,000 at lendingclub.com/martini. Much more on them a little bit later in the podcast, Jim. And even one more item on the agenda before we get to all the martinis dealing with Brett Kavanaugh. We need to revise and extend yesterday's good martini because now we can confirm, as most folks know by now, that every one of those young soccer players, as well as the coach, as well as all the rescue personnel, are out of the cave, the submerged cave in Thailand. The rescue effort, while extraordinarily complicated, was successful. We all still do remember the Thai SEAL who lost his life trying to get oxygen to the folks who were stranded in there a number of days ago. But the extraction of the 12 players and the coach, a rousing success, and we wish them a speedy recovery if any extensive medical work is needed. So more great news on that front today.
It is, Greg, and I think we all really needed a bit of, just joyous, happy ending kind of story like that. Now, I'm sure you said they're being taken to the hospital just to be on the safe side. Check them out. I'm sure it's a physical and mental ordeal, but the initial word is good on all of them. And now, Greg, we are free to yell at the coach. What the hell were you thinking?
Yes, 2 miles into a cave during monsoon season, as you said yesterday. Not the brightest decision there, to say the least. But thankfully, no tragedy with the young people. But all right, let's move on to the Supreme Court nomination. Of course, Anthony Kennedy announcing his retirement a couple of weeks back. President Trump stating several days ago that July 9th would be the date that he announced his nomination. There was all sorts of rampant speculation yesterday afternoon, Jim. It was almost kind of fun. It was a little bit too much of a circus, but we had people checking out the judges' homes. Oh, Amy Barrett's getting on a plane. Oh, no, she's home. Hardiman's people are being told to get ready to defend their candidate. No, it's not going to be him. Kethledge is at home. So it's got to be Kavanaugh. And Kavanaugh it is. President Trump, after extolling the Reagan administration and Antonin Scalia and Ed Meese, announcing his choice for U.S. Supreme Court.
In keeping with President Reagan's legacy, I do not ask about a nominee's personal opinions. What matters is not a judge's political views, but whether they can set aside those views to do what the law and the Constitution require. I am pleased to say that I have found, without doubt, such a person. Tonight, it is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
A rousing ovation there for Kavanaugh. And then Kavanaugh, in his comments, talked a little bit about his judicial philosophy.
My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent.
So, Jim, in our second martini, we'll get to what might have been, considering one of the other nominees. But in terms of Brett Kavanaugh, a lot of cheers, a lot of thumbs up from a lot of people that you and I respect. He seems to be a guy who understands the original intent of the Constitution. He's somebody who generally seems to champion individual liberty. There will be some question marks about how much he defers to the executive branch and so forth, and we'll get into plenty of stuff during the confirmation process. But we knew from this list that it would be a solid choice, and Brett Kavanaugh has a lot of things going for him that conservatives should like.
Yeah, if there's any conservatives out there who are having nagging doubts or wonder, could this guy be a suitor? Could this guy be a Kennedy? Could this be a guy who's going to disappoint us? Look, we don't know exactly what the future holds, but all the evidence we have says this guy is going to be fine. This guy is going to be just fine for a long time. And just about every group that makes up the conservative coalition was really thrilled with what they've seen from Judge Kavanaugh so far. Pro-lifers were thrilled. The NRA was thrilled. Small government types, those who want to roll back the regulatory state and the sense of the unaccountable bureaucracy, all of them are high-fiving over this. he's got a really solid record. And in fact, you might kind of argue this is one of those people who, it's right to say he's been groomed for the Supreme Court, but has exactly the kind of sterling resume and career and decisions and writing that you'd want to see for most folks on the right. He's not quite a clone of Neil Gorsuch, which might have been like, let's say that's the, that's not even the gold standard. Let's say that's the platinum standard. But Kavanaugh is really, really good. And just about anybody, look, most of us we pay attention to the Supreme Court when there's a big decision. We don't pay attention to every small court, every single fight that comes through. There are people who are conservative lawyers who argue these sorts of things before the court, worked in DOJ in previous administrations, worked with Kavanaugh when he was on the staff of the Bush White House. All of these folks who watch these sorts of things look at them and say, this guy's really good. He gets it backwards and forwards. There are one or two disagreements with that, which we'll address in the next martini. But by and large, this is the sort of justice that, or potential justice, that most conservatives will be nodding in agreement with and appreciating his perspective and his arguments and his writing for probably many decades to come. So just a really solid pick. And another feather in the cap of the Trump administration, assuming he gets confirmed. And at this point, it looks pretty darn likely, barring some giant scandal or skeleton in his closet or something like that. Kavanaugh is very likely to be the next Supreme Court justice.
No, I think that's exactly right. He was approved to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals back in 2006. Both Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski voted for him in that vote. I don't think that was lost on President Trump, who realizes he's got a pretty thin margin to work with, unless he can get at least some Democrats to come over. But let's move on to the second martini. And Jim, we've had some really bad martinis in the past. This is probably one of the less bad martinis we've ever had, but it's still worth pointing out that you don't get a lot of opportunities to nominate Supreme Court justices. This is the second one President Trump has gotten. And your colleague, David French, who substitutes for you frequently here on the Three Martini Lunch, has a couple different columns out, one in the Washington Post, and then he also wrote about it at The Corner, talking about how perhaps Trump could have done better if he had picked Amy Coney Barrett. Reading from David's Washington Post column first, he says, there was a moment in the early afternoon of July 9th when conservatives contemplated the delightful possibility that they might witness the best possible version of President Trump, the man with the will and flair for the dramatic that would allow him to be bolder than the average Republican president. The best version of Trump would have nominated Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Would another Republican have had the guts to put forward a nominee who would so clearly inflame the culture wars? Would another Republican president shatter the GOP nominee mold by selecting a mother of 7 kids, an outspoken Christian, and a graduate from a normal non-Ivy League law school? The base, motivating, electrifying pick was right there in the palm of his hand. Then he went establishment. He chose a man that any Republican president would have nominated. And then at The Corner, he adds, in discussing, as you did yesterday, Jim, about the fight that needs to happen about whether Christians can be in public service, he says Barrett's nomination wouldn't just have put an outstanding originalist on the court for 30 years. It would have helped blunt the force of secular bigotry. The direct confrontation between an angry secular left and an accomplished, poised Christian professional would have represented a culturally important moment. But alas, it was not to be. So while he did well, he might not have done as well as he could have.
Yeah, and as we all expected, by July 2018, David French would be criticizing Donald Trump for going establishment. Life had some unusual twists and turns. I was going to say, I feel David French. I too had kind of said that I thought Barrett was the best choice. And in fact, this was kind of an important fight to have. Some people really didn't like what I wrote yesterday, but I'll just say, look, clearly not all progressives, but a chunk of the Democratic Party, a chunk of the progressive movement, deep down just doesn't believe that, religious conservatives and devout Catholics, but I kept using the term and or yesterday, and a lot of people seem to suggest that I asked if I was suggesting that Catholics are not Christians. No, I am Catholic. I am Christian. I just used it to encompass 2 different groups of anti-religious bias. I'm sorry if my wording rubs some people the wrong way. The gist being that there are some people in the progressive movement who deep down think that Christians don't belong, some might argue, in public life at all. Certainly they don't belong on the federal bench. They just don't trust them. They just think that they're all ready to reenact the Inquisition. They're going to bring out the whole Mel Brooks musical number from History of the World. That they just, they're not just going to legislate from the bench. They're going to impose a theocracy, and it's going to turn into The Handmaid's Tale overnight if you get too many Catholics or too many Christians on the bench. Obviously, this is absolute, top to bottom, 100% BS nonsense. But I kind of feel like it's important to confront that attitude. And there's a part of me that felt like nominating Barrett would all right, let's have it. Let's have this argument. Because you knew that, while some Senate Democrats would probably have certainly some decent, some respectable, some appropriate criticisms of Barrett, you knew that, Dianne Feinstein's "the dogma lives loudly within you" is going to be, would be a good crux of the argument. In the end, no, you can't be a federal judge because you're just too religious. Which I think amounts to a religious test, and I think is fundamentally unconstitutional. I think also reveals that to some folks on the left, there's a basic anti-Christian bigotry at the heart of a chunk of their worldview. This is incendiary stuff for me, but that's how I see it. There's a lot of philosophy of, look, Amy Coney Barrett is a perfectly good new federal judge. She was a law professor for a lot of years, earned raves. Everybody agrees she knows the law backwards and forwards. There's an argument to be said that, some people say she's a bit of a black box, meaning that she hasn't been a judge for a particularly long time. So that while she has a lot of legal writing, law review articles, stuff like that, she doesn't have a ton of decisions to scrutinize and things like that. Look, it's entirely possible that sometime between now and the end of Trump's presidency, which could occur at the end of this term or it could occur at the end of two terms, that some other justice retires or rides on off into the sunset, so to speak. We know at the age of Ginsburg, the age of Breyer, it's possible that there's another opening on the Supreme Court, and Trump could very well pick Barrett. But it's not a guarantee. In fact, I believe people have actually done actuarial studies on the life history of the ancestors of the Supreme Court justices, trying to calculate how long they're going to live. And apparently, Ginsburg she's a tough old gal. She's not going to shuffle off anytime soon. So it's entirely possible that Ginsburg serves out the remainder of Trump's term, as does Breyer, as does every other justice. So every Supreme Court pick you make always has the possibility of being your last. So there is no guarantee of a next time for a Barrett. So that leaves some disappointment in the David Frenches of the world. And I see where he's coming from. I don't think this is that much of a knock on Kavanaugh. And in fact, I want to give credit to David for writing what I thought was one of the most even-handed critiques of Kavanaugh a few days before the pick. And he was quick to emphasize it's not that he didn't like Kavanaugh. He thought, Kavanaugh was, by just about every standard, qualified and, in fact, an excellent judge. He just didn't think he was the best possible choice. And it's hard to begrudge some social conservatives those feelings, knowing that as good as Kavanaugh is, Barrett would have been a great clarifying moment, and maybe kind of a moment that a lot of social conservatives have been yearning for a long time.
And when we get into conspiracy world in our crazy martini, we'll find out why Brett Kavanaugh was really the choice of President Trump. Very, very, very exciting. In the meantime, President Trump, regardless of whether you wanted Kavanaugh or Barrett, seems to have built up quite a bit of strong political capital. If your political capital or your actual financial capital isn't too strong, Lending Club might be the way to go for you. For decades, credit cards have been telling us to buy it now and pay for it later with interest. Despite your best intentions, that interest can get out of control fast.
With Lending Club, you can consolidate your debt and pay off credit cards with one fixed monthly payment. Since 2007, Lending Club has helped millions of people regain control of their finances with affordable fixed-rate personal loans. No trips to a bank, no high-interest credit cards. Just go to lendingclub.com, tell them about yourself and how much you want to borrow, pick the terms that are right for you, and if you're approved, your loan is automatically deposited into your bank account in as little as a few days. Lending Club is the #1 peer-to-peer lending platform with more than $35 billion in loans issued.
Go to lendingclub.com/martini. Check your rate in minutes and borrow up to $40,000. That's lendingclub.com/martini. lendingclub.com/martini. All loans made by WebBank, member FDIC, equal housing lender. And Jim, as we get into the crazy martini in relation to the Trump nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, you've, of course, got unhinged Twitter, but that's so predictable. We really didn't even get into that this time. Let's get into conspiracy theory Twitter, starting with Jeff Bennett, the White House correspondent, or at least a White House correspondent for NBC News this morning. Source familiar tells NBC that Justice Kennedy had been in negotiations with the Trump team for months over Kennedy's replacement. Once Kennedy received assurances that it would be Kavanaugh, his former law clerk, Kennedy felt comfortable retiring. He CC'd Frank Thorpe and Leigh Caldwell, who also report for NBC. Leigh Caldwell up on the Hill follows up on that, saying, furthermore, the 5 names Trump added to his list of Federalist-approved judges last November was to get Kavanaugh on that list. The other 4 names were considered cover per source. In other words, the decision has been baked for a while. Hugh Hewitt on his radio show talking to Leonard Leo, head of the Federalist Society, who usually takes a leave of absence when a Republican president is choosing a Supreme Court nominee, tells Hugh Hewitt, quote, "That is garbage. No way that is possible. That is insulting to Justice Kennedy," at which point Leigh Caldwell follows up, "To be clear, this is from one source, and we don't have any info on whether POTUS actually talked to Kennedy about a possible replacement." So dialing back that one pretty extensively once Leonard Leo weighed in. And Jim, in terms of unhinged liberals in person, Shannon Bream over at Fox News, one of the nicest people in media, was going to do her live 11 o'clock show from the steps of the Supreme Court, given the news. She was out there with, I believe, Sean Hannity when his show was on, but she actually had to cancel the live appearance for her own show and go back to the Fox News studio, which is just across Capitol Hill. But it's because it was too rowdy. She tweeted out, "Very few times I've felt threatened while out in the field. The mood here tonight is very volatile. Law enforcement appears to be closing down First Street in front of the Supreme Court." And then she says, "Literally had to bail on our live show from SCOTUS, moving the show back to the safety of the studio. See you all at 11. So, Jim, the tolerant left has reared its head again.
You know, there are a bunch of things that didn't make a lot of sense to me about that protest, Greg. The first being, they're protesting outside the Supreme Court building. Greg, was anyone in the Supreme Court building? It's not like the other 8 justices were in there. It's not like court's not in session. It's an empty building. I know the symbolism. You probably want the pillars of the backdrop. Okay, fine. But just the second thing was, you saw what they were chanting, Greg, was, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Kavanaugh has got to go." Greg, you and I would agree, because he's got to go to the Supreme Court. He's not on the Supreme Court yet. That's what the whole confirmation process is for. It's you guys, the protesters, who should be saying, "Hey, hey, 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 Kavanaugh has got to stay and not get promoted up to the Supreme Court." So there's that. Can't help but wonder if the Bream comments indicates this new, more confrontational, some would say more violent tone we're seeing from lefty protesters lately. I believe there were 9 people arrested. Regarding the Supreme Court conspiracy theory put forth by the NBC News Capitol Hill reporter, my colleague Charlie Cook has a good piece on NRO today saying this is why media is hated. And sometimes that criticism gets a little overwrought, but really, when you're just kind of blurting out conspiracy theories on, I don't really know if this is true, but a source told me. That's not reporting. That's not journalism, right? That's just basically, hey, I heard it from a guy. I mean, this could be some, guy on the street corner yelling at, the dogs are sending him messages or something like that. Or it could be somebody really well connected. I suppose my suspicion is that if, one of the Supreme Court clerks told me this, well, then all of a sudden it has a lot more credibility. If you didn't specify the credentials of your source, well, then I'm guessing your source doesn't have that many credentials. My guess is it's probably some unhinged Democratic member of Congress or Democratic staffer. I don't want to sound like a crotchety old man here, but Greg, you get trained in journalism, your first gigs, and working in bureaus as interns. Editors yell at you if you don't have 2 sources on a big story like this. Gordon Ramsay in the kitchen, putting two pieces of bread on each side of your head and saying, "What are you?" And you have to answer an idiot sandwich. That's the kind of treatment you get when a reporter comes with a single source on a giant conspiracy theory type piece like this. It's rather revealing. She put it out on Twitter and not on actual reporting or stuff like that. Look, could it have happened? Look, yes, and also it's very possible that Brett Kavanaugh is a space alien. We haven't disproved that one either. So that's where we are. And just kind of finally, I just want to observe one last point on those protesters yesterday. They brought signs that said "Stop Kavanaugh," They also had signs for Stop Barrett. I assume they had signs for Stop Ketledge. Basically it was whoever Trump picks is the worst possible choice. But if that's the case, then none of them are the worst possible choice. And if you want to say, look, we oppose any selection by President Trump, that's fine. You can have that position. But don't try to sell me then that, Kavanaugh is uniquely bad or you just hated anybody he was going to pick. So, there was no chance you were going to come out and say, I don't like this choice, but there were other ones that worse or something like that. Your blanket, and it was rather revealing. I believe there was one organization that put out the, Kavanaugh is terrible and we will stop her. Used the wrong gender, indicated clearly they were expecting Barrett and didn't bother to go through and check and change the language on it. And I believe it was March for Justice or the Women's March. Somebody said, we are upset that XX has been nominated. Insert name here. It's like, okay, guys, we know where you stand. This is basically saying whoever Trump picked, we were going to be upset, which is kind of like saying, all right, there's no authenticity there. This is a prearranged setup. And if you want to have that position, fine. But then it also kind of demonstrates it's not that there was no pick Trump could have made that these groups would have been happy with. So, let them do what they want to do. That's no one should be surprised or really pay that much attention to them.
Jim, I saw that. I think it was you that tweeted out last night that you got a press release that condemned the nomination without ever mentioning who the nominee was. So they obviously had it ready to go before the announcement had been made. But on a personal basis, I know you reject identity politics, but I'm sure you're excited that an Irishman is poised to be on the court here, right?
It is, yes. Now, this does play into the Catholics are taking over. Conspiracy theories. And, I'm sure at some point, as somebody said, it really makes whatever, Kavanaugh coaches CYO basketball teams. And before you know it, it's going to turn into, something out of the Da Vinci Code or something like that.
Oh, it's going to be a fun few weeks here. Absolutely. No doubt about it. Jim, we've got our nominee, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to visit our friends, if you need their help, over at lendingclub.com/martini, lendingclub.com/martini. And tune in again Wednesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.